Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
I'm David Myers, your host for the episode and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Today, we're going to be talking about the past and future of affirmative action. On June 29, 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled by a 6-3 vote to end race-conscious admissions programs at universities and colleges. This decision brought to an end a fraught 45-year history of Supreme Court litigation, commencing with the University of California versus Bakke decision in 1978, in which the court held that affirmative action was indeed constitutional. Affirmative action, of course, belongs to a much wider frame of racial relations and structural inequity in this country. To give us much-needed historical perspective on that wider frame, I'm pleased to have on this episode of Then and Now a friend, colleague, and previous guest and host, Eddie Cole. Eddie is a professor of higher education and history at UCLA and is the author of the award-winning book from 2020, The Campus Color Line: College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. The book explores the decidedly uneven path of Black students in the American university and college system, set against the policies of predominantly white institutions led by overwhelmingly white administrators in a period of tumultuous change in the United States. Eddie Cole is a leading national expert on the intersection of African American history, the legacy of racism in the United States, and higher education, all of which brings us to this conversation on affirmative action. Welcome back to Then and Now, Eddie.
Hey, thanks for having me, David. Always good to be back.
Great. So let's jump right in. You really have a much wider lens through which you observe affirmative action and its role in American society. As you see it, it's not a matter of a number of decades, of 45 years or so, because in a recent article in The Guardian, you suggested that, in fact, to understand what's going on, we have to actually reach back much further in time, at least to the Reconstruction era, to help us set the frame. So can you take us back to that time to help us understand sort of the deep history of what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great opening question. And going back to Reconstruction brings me to this idea that Black access to American higher education is arguably the most contested idea within the academy, because for centuries now, and centuries, plural, S, right? We've seen the important struggle for Black people to attain higher education, but there have always been sort of formal and informal policies to push back against that access. And that includes both Black people getting access to predominantly white, or back then all white universities, as well as Black people seeking to build up their own Black colleges and universities. There's been strategic, systemic effort to work against that access. So when we look at the recent decision by the Supreme Court and the questions that have been immediately raised around who gets to go to college and who doesn't, for me, as someone who studies higher education history, it's important for us to go back even as far as Reconstruction to look at how Black people have been stopped at the door over and over again. And that raises a number of questions around higher education, its role, its power, and what it even means within shaping American society.
So just as race is, in some sense, the organizing principle of American society and politics, you argue that race is or indeed the organizing principle of American higher education. That's a very sweeping claim.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you had to think about the historic role of the university in the United States, right? And now we can go back 400 years, not just the Reconstruction. We can go back to the oldest college in the United States, which is Harvard. So we're going back to 1636 at this point. And even if you look sort of across the past 400 years, sort of a consistent theme, race is embedded within the most basic decisions around what's taught in higher education, who was even welcome into the classrooms. And even though you could say, yeah, there were some indigenous students welcomed into the colonial colleges, that had a very racialized motive behind why those students were even allowed on those soon to be college campuses. So yes, for me, higher education, as I see it, sits within being a tool to maintain American society at large. So if many historians have argued, if race is the organizing principle behind the United States in general, then obviously it's colleges and universities and their foundation, it stems from that broader societal thought. And so colleges and universities for centuries now have maintained racial hierarchies and societal oppression in many other ways that other entities within the United States have. So we can't separate higher education institutions in the US from broader societal issues.
Right. Of course, this flies in the face of sort of a kind of mythic rendering of the university or higher education as a portal of entry into the mainstream of society. And I suppose that is true for some and decidedly not true for others, particularly Black Americans. In your thinking of this sort of long history, you notice that there was a brief glimmer of hope that came, not surprisingly, in the 1960s. And in fact, not in the time of Lyndon Johnson, but before that, in John F. Kennedy's brief tenure as president. You describe an initiative that Kennedy undertook to try and crack open the American Academy. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah. The 1960s gives us a lot of insight into what could have been, because for those who focus on sort of the modern civil rights movement, not the long civil rights, but sort of the very sort of focused 1950s and 1960s, you have to look at the decisions by Kennedy and his interest in higher education becoming more equitable within his global perspective, right? So post World War II, during the Cold War, you look at sort of international pressure on the United States as a nation that had framed itself as a proponent of democracy, right? Fighting in global fights to maintain equality. Yet there was obvious second-class citizenship treatment toward Black Americans domestically that put a lot of pressure on Kennedy, and it actually weakened the United States from an international perspective. I mean, the contradictions were all over the place. So understanding that international pressure and also the implosion of mass media, right, coming along, television, all these things start to happen to where the civil rights struggles become global news, right? Those images from Birmingham, Selma, and many other cities across the U.S. South capture our allies' attention and says, well, hey, what are you going to do about it, United States? As a response, President Kennedy does what most elected officials do today. When there's a complex social problem, you reach out to a university, because what other place is supposed to have the people smart enough to solve complex problems? And so in the summer of 63, Kennedy reaches out to a number of college presidents, both leaders of predominantly white institutions and leaders of historically Black colleges, to come up with what he called, quote, special programs, end quote, that were aimed at sort of rectifying the legacy of racism in the United States. And that's a very important takeaway, that Kennedy's first request to higher education was to address the grave civil rights problems, not to make colleges more racially diverse, which we can get to later, but to actually address the history and legacy of racism. And so those initial programs that presidents came up with included a lot of attention toward historically Black colleges. There were these faculty and staff exchange programs. There were partnerships between these campuses. There's big investment from the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. There's this widespread brief moment, say 63 until, say, almost the late 60s, to where there's widespread investment in historically Black colleges alongside white campuses considering race in college admissions. That was affirmative action. It was a broad series of programs aimed at system-wide change in American higher education, not just about a few white institutions admitting a few Black students.
Before we get back to this to sort of assess its success, I want to just pick up on something that you said that interests me. The idea that diversity and attending to sort of the long legacy of racism in America are not identical pursuits. There is, as I think I understand you, a need to address in the form of reparative justice that long legacy that is not fully satisfied by diversifying our campuses. Can you sort of unpack that?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about the 1960s and you think about the United States by the 60s. First, by that point, if you sort of look at the history of the nation, even before it was a nation, you got probably 250 years of legal enslavement. And then after that, you've got another 100 years post Reconstruction of really legal racial segregation, right? And so you get to the 1960s and you say, well, if you look across racial lines, if you're not white, there have been some remarkable advantages to having sort of a multi-century head start toward equality. And so when you look at the civil rights protests, it wasn't just a matter of, ending racial equality in that moment and saying, hey, everybody is going to be all equal now. It was understanding that when you haven't been able to own property for centuries, right? When you haven't been able to have generations of your family attain higher education and start careers and, hand down businesses from one generation to the next. When you look at accumulated wealth, when you look at social status, that's what Kennedy acknowledged, was forced to acknowledge. And so that when we think about affirmative action, its initial goals were set around addressing that long legacy of disadvantage that was present, which is dramatically different from saying, hey, University of Michigan, hey, University of California, Berkeley, you should become more racially diverse. That's just because your student body looks different doesn't mean you're addressing those centuries of past wrongdoings.
So let's go back to JFK's initiative as he sought to do, extend equal educational opportunity to Black students. How did it go?
Well, there was promise, and then there was not so much promise. Initially, a few fascinating things happened. When you look at the summer of 63 through 1964, you get some really rich, robust partnerships. And I want to talk about these partnerships for a moment because we see a lot of that reoccurring today, those talking points post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor. A lot of that is coming up today. And there are some red flags that we should be aware of if colleges are going to try that now because we've been here before. And so just a few partnerships, for instance, look, the University of Michigan created a formal partnership with Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University in Alabama. Brown University had one with Tougaloo College. The University of Wisconsin had one with North Carolina Central, North Carolina A&T, and Texas Southern, with three different Black colleges in the South. And there's really a rich opportunity to where faculty who were teaching at Black colleges had opportunities to attend summer institutes on these white campuses or pursue graduate study to a certain extent, where there also was an opportunity for the white campuses that were actively recruiting Black students for the first time to actually learn how to educate Black students in a really fair, equitable way if they'd actually maintain these partnerships with the Black colleges. In a lot of ways, it was win-win. But something interesting happens really by the time you get into the mid to late 60s. Media, which I mentioned earlier, actually plays an influential role in higher education then and now, because we think so much about rankings and prestige. And the same sort of desire was there for white institutions at the same time. And media attention toward these partnerships leaned heavily toward private white colleges and universities, much more than the public institutions. So, as you can imagine, Princeton's partnership got more attention than, say, University of Wisconsin's partnerships, right? And therefore, soon the attention toward the Black college campuses actually had an unfortunate shift where those programs were dismantled, underfunded, and sort of left behind as more positive publicity ended up being turned toward what it looks like to have your first group of Black students from insert the heart of nearby city on these illustrious elite private institution campuses. Therefore, the Black programs, which were aimed toward system-wide change, slowly fell apart as most attention quickly shifted to considering race in college admissions on highly selective campuses.
Right. And you also suggest that in addition to this sort of very logical shift from a focus on Black institutions to elite, predominantly white institutions, there also was a measure of blowback against the very principle of some redress, or as it might be described, preferential treatment. And of course, this is something that Dr. Martin Luther King was keenly aware of in the wake of the passage of the Voting Rights Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act in the mid-1960s, that invariably there would be a pushback, a backlash. Was that present in the wake of the Kennedy Initiative?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was backlash immediately, and much of those talking points revolved around the question around merit and quality, which you hadn't heard before race was introduced in college admissions. And so there were faculty on many of these institutions that wondered why the university was actively seeking to recruit Black students, for instance. And if that meant that the campus was starting to lower its academic standards by recruiting those Black students. And there's so much racism interwoven within that backlash that suggests that just because those Black students did not come from the typical settings, right? Sort of the suburban prep schools or great public institutions, that because they came from the heart of many cities, the Detroits, the Newarks, Chicagos, et cetera, that it meant that these major predominantly white institutions were changing their academic standards to allow those students to get in. And that actually, this idea of merit in American higher education has been around for a long time, although the conversation of merit is often code word for whiteness in a lot of ways. And so it dismisses what a good student looks like just based on how that student, comes in the door, not even seeing if they can perform academically. And that backlash was almost immediate, and it had long-standing effects.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that criterion of merit was very rarely entered in conversation when discussing legacy, which was such an anchoring principle of the elite white institutions, especially of the Northeast.
Yeah, well, merit then and now, no one thought about, how well of a student you were. It was a matter of really your family trajectory and where you come from. And that was the number one criteria needed. So when you look at how merit has been deployed as a mechanism to limit who can and cannot come into the academy, you also had to think about, if you're going to talk about merit and even have legacy around, when you have this history of racial discrimination in admissions, a Black student isn't going to have the opportunity to lean on legacy because their previous generations have been denied admission. And so using legacy and deploying the term merit is also strategic, as we see in so many ways.
Let's move ahead to 1978, the year in which the Supreme Court decided in the University of California v. Bakke case, whereby the court held that racial quotas in university admissions were unconstitutional, but affirmative action could be constitutional. I'm wondering how you see Bakke with the benefit of historical experience 45 years later. What impact did it have?
Yeah, well, it had an impact in two ways. One, it becomes sort of the first high-level challenge to affirmative action, right? It's significant in that way because even though there have been backlash, when we think about Supreme Court level decisions, Bakke is usually the starting point when we think about challenges to affirmative action. So affirmative action existed way before then, but fast forward to 1978, we get that decision. So it's significant in the sense of it being the first significant court case. It's also significant in the sense that Bakke in the deliberations shifted the narrative around what affirmative action was supposed to be. And this may have been, successful strategy by those challenging affirmative action, but they pushed people who supported affirmative action and defended affirmative action to start using those talking points around the benefits of racial diversity on campus, which is a significant shift from our earlier point around what the Kennedy administration and later the Johnson administration deemed important coming out of the White House was to address the legacy of racism in the United States. Bakke is significant because not only of its Supreme Court ruling that defended and protected affirmative action, but also because of the talking point around affirmative action for the last 45 years has been around the benefits of diversity. And that is so important as we fast forward, even to think about 2023 and the court's ruling, and still not being able to land on the benefits of diversity and whether that's even necessary. Because believe it or not, if you look in 2023, it may be easier to justify the need for continued redress toward racial discrimination and the legacy of racism in the United States, more so than the need to say colleges need to get more racially diverse. But because Bakke shifted the talking points, it will always be significant because of that.
Might it be that that strategy, that rhetorical strategy emerged because of the perception that the language of diversity was likelier to succeed in white America than the language of racial redress and reparative justice?
Well, absolutely. I mean, whenever you use diversity, just the simple semantics of it, you're not saying race, right? And so more people can look at the word diversity on paper. More people can look at you stand at a podium and say the word diversity and not feel as bad about it because you're not talking race, right? And so some people hear diversity and also hear race, but arguably that shift in talking point made it a little bit softer for people both for and against affirmative action to sort of digest campus diversity as something beneficial, because all of a sudden, a lot of people can point to their uniqueness as a form of diversity. But if you're white in America and you say, hey, well, I grew up in a rural area, right? Not necessarily a major, well-developed metropolis, right? I too bring some diversity to a campus as a rural white American. Well, using diversity as a standard, yes, that is completely true. But what that does is it shifts admissions decisions and it shifts the power of education toward rectifying past wrongs away from addressing race to trying to do this all-encompassing, near impossible thing of trying to acquire diversity.
Right. And now the Supreme Court has come along in 2023 and said that, in fact, university admissions policies must be colorblind, right? We need to erase race from the consideration that goes into university admissions. A decision anticipated some decades before by Proposition 209 in the state of California. I'm going to read what Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in his opinion from 2023. Many universities have for too long concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice.
Well, we can say a lot about what the Constitution does tolerate and what it has tolerated. Part of Chief Justice Roberts, opinion there is somewhat disingenuous and certainly ahistorical in a lot of ways, because the Constitution has, unfortunately for many people, strongly considered race in a lot of ways, even from its initial formation. And so the decision of the court to sort of strike down the significance of race in admissions, because I think the court did say if a student wants to explain their race another way, they can, but it can't be sort of a deciding factor the way we thought. Either way, the court has sort of taken an unrealistic approach to life in general, particularly in the United States. Assuming for colleges to do something that society has yet to do. And for colleges to make decisions around who brings value into the classroom, who's worthy of admission, whose perspectives are valued. But of all things, you can't consider race in doing so, which raises all sorts of questions around, to your previous point, around legacy, the family members, be it children or close relatives of major donors, certainly student athletes, and especially some very affluent, heavily white sports get a leg up in very unique ways. But race, of all things, can't be considered. And in so many ways, the Supreme Court's decision, unfortunately, reminds us that that most contested idea against who gets to go to college and being anti-Black people, this court decision actually affirms very much what has been happening since before Reconstruction.
Eddie, what do you think the impact of this ruling will be? I mean, the Biden administration, in sort of its own version of a response, is trying to attack the principle of legacy as a criterion of admissions. I mean, that's one small piece of a much larger system. What do you think the impact will be? And what should we be thinking about doing?
Well, the immediate impact likely is going to be similar to what we saw in California in 1996 with Proposition 209, in the sense that Black student enrollment, let's just use UCLA and Berkeley as two campuses because they're frequently sought after in terms of college admissions. Black student enrollment in the incoming freshman class, starting immediately in 1998 when Prop 209 went into effect, dropped by more than half, right? And that happened in California, which has long framed itself as a much more progressive state compared to its peers across the nation. So imagine what we're likely to see happen in the majority of states that are actively passing or suggesting legislation that bans what aspects of Black history are taught, that are defunding anything that says diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Many of those same states are also dismantling the faculty tenure system. So even if you are admitted to some of these campuses as a student of color and faculty want to speak up and defend those few students of color, the tenure protections are significantly weakened on those campuses, as well as if you don't want to go to the predominantly white campuses, your choice of a historically Black college or university is going to be slim because those institutions have been woefully underfunded for decades. And so, David, what I see is really this sort of 5-point attack on Black access to American higher education. And after this decision, we very well could see not just the numbers drop in terms of highly selective, predominantly white institutions, which are only, maybe 3 or 4 dozen that we typically talk about, is not only going to impact those really elite campuses. This is going to have a widespread impact on all American higher education, regardless of whether you're a 2-year or 4-year campus, private or public campus, in a red or blue state, or a large or small institution. This decision will have a significant ripple effect for decades to come.
And what role do you see in this new moment of reaction for historically Black colleges and universities?
Well, I think a couple things. If you're leading a historically Black college, you're likely or potentially going to see an increase in applications, right? But you're going to have to be able to go to your big donors if you're a private institution, or your state legislator if you're a public institution, and say, if you're going to pass this legislation that many Black students feel doesn't welcome them on our state's predominantly white campuses, then you must also pass another piece of legislation that can come and accommodate where those students think they can attend, which is our campuses, right? So there has to be sort of this immediate talking point around saying, if you're going to pass this, this is going to be the effect. We've seen this in the past. Look at California. Look at our admissions numbers. We're seeing an uptick. But also, using the state of Tennessee as an example, Tennessee State University, which is that state's only public historically Black campus, from 1950 to 2007, the state of Tennessee never matched its federal requirement around land grant funds for Tennessee State, which is a public Black land grant institution. We're talking about toward upwards of more than $500 million. I want to say the number's around $544 million owed from the state of Tennessee to one underfunded historically Black college. Imagine what rectifying what these states owe their Black colleges would do in terms of accommodating what I anticipate is going to be an uptick in the applicants.
It seems once again that the pendulum of race has swung to the side of reaction after a brief moment of positioning at the side of opening and receptivity. And I'm wondering, especially as a student of university leadership, you just talked about what leaders of Black institutions might do. What about leaders of predominantly white institutions, including your own, UCLA? What do you counsel for university leadership to do in this moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, as someone who studies history, I find myself in more contemporary conversations with university leaders than I ever anticipated. And many of them ask that same question, what do we do? And my immediate response is always community centered. And you've got to leave the gates of your campus. You've got to go beyond your campus and actually go into these communities and let them know that you are an institution where students seeking higher education should apply and want to come there. And UCLA should also be actively leaving its beautiful perch on the west side, surrounded by Brentwood, Bel Air, and Beverly Hills, and maybe think about actually it's standing out into different parts of LA County and frankly across the state and nation. To say UCLA is a place that, despite what the Supreme Court has ruled, we still would love you to apply. We still love to have you in our applicant pool. And that's going to be important. That's going to be significant because currently institutions, especially highly selective institutions, get more than enough applicants and they simply expect people to find them. But we're in a new climate now. We're in a new moment. And as you talk about sort of the pendulum swinging, going back and forth, it's going to be critical for leaders to push back in the other direction and push themselves outside of what they typically do and into a whole new world that goes out and finds brilliant, bright students in all different corners, not just the usual spaces.
Drawing on your rich historical knowledge, is there any hope in believing that we can push the pendulum back in the other direction?
Absolutely. There has to be hope because otherwise, what are we even doing here if there's no hope? But there's hope only because history gives us so many other dark moments like the one we feel right now. And despite those gruesome dark moments of the past, we've seen brightness come behind them, right? I talk about the Reconstruction era in my piece for The Guardian, and I use the University of Mississippi chancellor, a quote from 1870, to where that chancellor, who was a white man, said that never did that faculty think it was proper for a Black student to attend that institution. Well, fast forward, obviously, 150 years. And now you could argue the University of Mississippi in so many ways is dependent on Black students in so many very interesting and unique ways, not just as student athletes or something, but just culturally rich, just really inviting, promising brilliance and pushing that institution into spaces that it wouldn't go on its own. So even despite a quote like that from the 1870s, if you look over the longer history, the past 150 years, you've seen people push back. And so I have to remain hopeful. I have to have some optimism that 15, 20, 25 years from now, we still see higher education being pushed to change in really inviting ways, despite the many efforts to close the doors of the academy.
On that note, I want to thank Professor Eddie Cole, author of The Campus Color Line and leading national expert on the history of higher education in the United States, for taking time to be with us on Then and Now. Thank you so much, Eddie.
Hey, thank you, David. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.